Hello, everyone, and welcome to Garden Gossip, the home and garden show, with your hosts, Lisa and Nancy, editors of BigBlendMagazine.com.
Hey everybody, welcome to Big Blend Radio's Garden Gossip Show with Nancy and Lisa. We are the crazy mother-daughter travel team and publishers of Big Blend Radio and TV Magazine. That's our variety publication that does cover gardening and nature. And also we publish Parks and Travel Magazine, obviously covering parks and travel, as well as our Love Your Parks tour as we travel across the country, documenting parks and public lands. And one of the things that's really important is our parks and public lands, and also what we're doing in our urban spaces, in our gardens. Are we planting the right thing to attract pollinators, butterflies, bees, bats, birds? And we're very excited to have Kim Eierman back on the show. She is the founder of Eco Beneficial, and today she's going to talk about how we can really help pollinators in our gardens. It's basically, listen, like we have dead zones in the ocean from oil spills and all kinds of things, climate change. But we need to look at what we're doing in all the spaces that we have to help pollinators, because they really do help our food and they're pretty and it's part of the cycle of nature. So she's joining us to talk about that. Her book is out, her brand new book. It's beautiful. Everyone, you got to get it. It's so beautiful. And it has really good hardcore information to get us started to help pollinators. It's called the Pollinator Victory Garden. It's available now through Quarry Books and, of course, Amazon, all your favorite bookstores. And if it's not in your local bookstore, go ask them to put it in there. But you can also go right to Kim's website. It's ecobeneficial.com. So welcome back, Kim. How are you?
Oh, thank you so much for having me again. I'm great. I'm past the flu.
Yeah, we all got it. The flu this year. Listen, and I wonder about that. This sounds terrible, but when all that stuff's in the air, can sickness hurt pollinators like bees? I mean, do they get the flu because we sneezed on a plant? I
Well,
wonder.
That's a really interesting question. So, there are some diseases and illnesses that can cross species, but I think by and large, the viruses that bees and other pollinators get are a little bit different than the ones that we get.
Mm.
So yes, I don't know if we're sharing germs yet, but
but we are doing things that we are part of the issue of their decline, right? When you look at these.
Without a doubt, habitat loss, pesticide use, fragmented landscapes, lack of floral resources. These are all things that unfortunately we've kind of done as human beings, but we can undo them and we can improve the situation. That's why I wrote the book.
And victory gardens.
Awesome.
I love the title Victory Gardens. I mean, even now, I remember our White House used to have a garden to teach kids about fresh vegetables and fruits and, things like that. And victory gardens were done, I remember back in World War II, not that I was there then, but I remember stories about this, the importance of those gardens. And tell us a little bit about the title, Victory Gardens.
Sure. So
I'm familiar with World War II.
Yeah, actually in World War I as well. It's not quite as well known, but in both World Wars, there were these victory gardens for food defense. It was basically a way to get people engaged who couldn't participate in any other way in the war effort. And I know in World War II, at least 20 million American households created victory gardens to be part of the war effort. So I thought about this and I thought, well, it's time to actually do the same kind of thing, but this time to help pollinators. And the dirty little secret is if you help pollinators, you're helping your entire ecosystem. So you're going to have really a wide-ranging positive impact by following some of these ideas.
And when you talk about pollinators helping the whole ecosystem, like to me, talking about dead zones, it's something that's kind of been stuck in my brain for the last few years about how we are using our landscaping in our backyards, even, in regards to where we're growing our own vegetables and fruits. A lot of us are doing that so that they're organic, but our roadways, our community parks. So when you look at a victory garden for a pollinator, like for me, I think it transcends the backyard, right? It can go everywhere.
Absolutely. Victory gardens can be absolutely anywhere. Even if you live in an apartment and you have a balcony with some containers, you can create a little mini victory garden, no matter how small the landscape. But
Mm.
one of the points you're raising is we've got to really start thinking pesticide free. If we're going to support pollinators, it's about being pesticide free. And that is so critically important. My book, in fact, is dedicated to Rachel Carson, who
Mm.
wrote Silent Spring.
Mm-hmm.
And
She rocks.
yeah, and synthetic pesticides have gotten us into a lot of trouble. But unfortunately, some folks don't realize that, organic pesticides are not benign, and some of our organic preparations can be lethal or sublethal to delicate creatures like bees and other pollinators. So really changing our perspective about our landscapes, giving up perfection, and also thinking about what nature does to keep things in balance. Nature, a healthy natural ecosystem, and we can create those, has an abundance of small flowered native plants that support beneficial insects. Our garden allies that prey on insects that are pest insects. So it's really about planting to attract these beneficials to keep our pests in check. And if we take care of our plants and keep them healthy, we will not have as many problems and diseases, etc.
Would that also help the soil?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And that's a really good point. Getting to know your soil sounds kind of silly, but that's important. So when I work with clients, I always suggest that they first do a soil test through their local extension, and really gets a handle on what the pH is and what the soil texture is, and if there are any macro and micronutrients that are really out of balance. Because only then can we figure out what's the right combination of plants to plant for our particular situation.
Especially, I think if you move into like a new home and they just constructed it,
Yeah.
there's a whole lot of stuff left there that you might not know that's in your soil.
And they tend to strip off topsoil when new housing goes in, which is really terrible. So what we can do is start thinking about how we build up that soil biology to support plants, which in turn support wildlife, including pollinators. And that's about getting life back into the soil. It's said that a teaspoon of healthy soil has more microorganisms than there are people on the planet. I mean, it is filled with life. So getting compost teas, these kinds of things to increase soil biology and minimizing disturbance as much as possible are really keys.
And native plants, there's something, as we travel and go through different parks, we start to see native plants. What's interesting about being park travelers, last time we chatted with you, we were based in Tucson, Arizona, and right outside Saguaro National Park. We travel, as human beings, we travel to parks to see things like Joshua trees, saguaros, to see, the giant coastal redwoods and Sequoia National Park. You go there for sequoia trees. You go to these places to see these unique plants. But I'm like, part of our makeup is that we should be coexisting with them in our neighborhoods, in our gardens, because that's integrity to the land and who we are in each of our areas. So I find that interesting, but I also see that as we've traveled, that we're going to these parks to see things like saguaros, but before you get on a hiking trail, you need to scrape your boots off. Even your backpacks and things. I want to talk about bats with you big time because that's a huge deal. But we're scraping our shoes off because park travelers, we're carrying seeds from another park in. So we're seeing the native plants, and you cover this in your book. You talk about kudzu. Is it kudzu? Because we saw that in Louisiana. Kudzu.
That awful thing. Yeah.
Well, I thought it was pretty until I read your book.
Yeah. Well, it's so for listeners, kudzu is one of our most difficult invasive vines that just completely swallows up ecosystems and eliminates the native plants that would be there. We have such a problem with invasive plants in this country now, on every state in the nation, and we need to be aware of that. Don't plant them. If you have them, remove them and replace with natives. It's all about evolution. We can't get away from that. Wildlife has evolved with the native plants that support them, and sometimes they're very intricate connections. I think most people know of the monarch butterfly caterpillar, and milkweeds. It's obligate host plant. But there's so many examples like that that we are really not informed about. And Mother Nature kind of really does know best. So if we can support her, we're going to support pollinators too.
And when the one thing I've seen too is you changing your landscape, you don't have to like suddenly rip out your entire yard, right? You
Yeah,
can
I
do it
think that
step by step, right?
it can be very intimidating to face the task of just making complete change. I caution clients not to do that, to take small steps and create projects in priority order, and start small. Get a success under your belt. Have a fantastic pollinator garden. It's maybe a pollinator island in the middle of that green desert, your lawn, and then keep going with it. But if you make it more scalable, so you can accomplish it, you're going to be in much better shape than try to take on too much at once.
You have some great tips, especially at the appendix part of your book, talking about, here's your tips, here's what you do, but you talk about planting in succession too. So you have to know your seasons, which we need to know for our food as well, right?
Sure. Well, there are so many principles to pollinator gardening and gardening with native plants. And one of them, as you mentioned, is planting for that succession of bloom. In a lot of parts of the country, that's going to be from spring through fall, but in warmer parts of the country, it may be year round. So we really want to have overlapping times when multiple native plants are in bloom. So we constantly have a source of forage for pollinators. But here's the catch. We also have to plant diversely, because different pollinators are attracted to different types of flowers, and the characteristics that they've evolved with are called pollination syndromes. So what's going to be accessible and appealing to a bat, for example, is going to be very different for, say a native bumblebee. So having a diverse array of flowering plants of different flower structure, colors, sizes, shapes, etc., and even fragrance. While a bee can smell a fresh scent, a bird has no sense of smell. So it won't be, a fragrant plant isn't really useful to a bird, will be to a moth. So we need to achieve what I call floral balance, this balance between plant diversity and plant sufficiency, enough of a given plant where pollinators can find it, and then have a succession of diverse bloom throughout the entire growing season, and that growing season will depend on where you live.
So this is like farm to table in your backyard.
Yeah, there you go.
It's like running a restaurant. Like you want to, so-and-so doesn't, no, this is a vegetarian over here. No, this one, that one is an omnivore. So we can,
right.
And carnivores, right? So you also want to have that, because you can even
Absolutely.
aren't there also, I remember when we lived up in Joshua Tree area, and Tucson too, the datura at night would shine with the moon. And
so cool.
Different plants things happen at night, because that's important that we talk about it, because that also bats like to go and hang out on the saguaros at night.
Right. And, so we have a limited number of pollinating bats in North America, and they're mostly centered in the Southwest, parts of very Southern California. And they're really important to plants like agave and saguaro cactus. They're absolutely critical pollinators, but they're going to be active at night, and they're going to be looking for very fragrant flowers that have a fragrance at night and are just loaded with dilute nectar. So that's that's something to think about if you're in that part of the country. Bat pollination is really key, and as you've alluded to, bats are really suffering population crashes in North America. Unfortunately, a lot of it's due to human activity.
That we've noticed that in parks, because some caves you can't go into because they have like a white something or other.
White nose syndrome,
Yeah, the white nose,
yeah.
The spelunkers, the ones who go caving, unfortunately often have tracked things in these caves. So really, trying to understand the creatures that we want to support a little bit more, understanding what their needs are, and what's risky for them is key. So habitat is a subject matter that most people don't talk about when they talk about gardening. So we don't have to just give pollinators floral resources and host plants in the case of moth and butterfly caterpillars, but we have to provide them with habitat. And as an example, our native bees, we have tons and tons and tons of native bees, about 3,600 named species of native bees in North America. Yeah.
Wow.
And about another 400 that are unnamed. So maybe 4,000 species of native bees throughout North America. And the vast majority of these native bees are solitary. So they need individual homes. And the majority of those bees are going to be nesting in the ground. So thinking about reserving an area of our landscapes in a sunny area where the soil is not too compacted and not too wet, an area that's really bee habitat territory is going to be an important part of this. And then for the other percent of bees that are native, the other 30%, so 70% nest in the ground, about 30% nest in cavities, old mouse holes, tree cavities, pithy plant stems, even in beetle burrows of dead trees. So we need to start thinking about not just flowers, but habitat too.
And that's interesting because when like we've learned over the years, don't rake up your leaves because that becomes a habitat.
Yep.
And fall and winter, you cover that in your book too, which is so important. But everybody needs a home, and everybody has a different. And when you look at, when we go out house hunting or apartment hunting or condo hunting, whatever it is, you're looking for a place that suits you. So I'm just trying to put it into the human terms for everyone.
Sure, absolutely.
And I think what's interesting about this too is, like, again, I'm going to go like Tucson, people have saguaro cactus in their neighborhoods. We're lucky that way. Not that we're there anymore, but it was awesome what they did, because it's also a dark sky community, which is really great.
Oh, that's
for
great.
Bats, right?
Yeah, and birds.
Yeah, so you had javelinas running in the neighborhoods, and they did a good. They are still doing even more in that regard. But when you have that habitat in your backyard, and you can actually create all these different habitats, things that we've learned in parks are the parks, how they do have these diverse habitats. You start to see all kinds of species. Pinnacles National Park in Central California has over 400 bee species, which is insane. But they also had to go through a stage of, there was wild boar, there was all these things that weren't supposed to be there, and they had to do a lot of cleaning out of the land to make things happen. So it's interesting going places like that to see it, but then bringing it home and going, okay, don't take anything out of a park. I mean, bring it on home, and have that visual of what could be in your own backyard.
Right.
And I think for kids especially, to be part of that process, to understand by having it in your backyard, like you said, even if it's, when we're in an apartment, we had native plants on our backyard, and we watch verdins with their babies come for water. It was amazing, little verdin birds. So you can do this in most places, or you can even go rent a plot. But
absolutely, community gardening too.
But when you watch that, then you have this understanding, and you're part of the process. You're part of the ecosystem then.
Anyone who has a landscape has an ecosystem, and often it's pretty damaged. So a really good idea is to go to local natural areas that are near you and see what's there and what it looks like and the plants that are growing. Ignore the invasive plants, okay?
Yeah.
But get a sense of what should be there and reflect that in your planting, because those are the plants that are going to support pollinators and other wildlife. And, a landscape that's filled with life is so much more interesting than a landscape that is denuded of wildlife. And where I am, I'm in New York, north of Manhattan, and I have neighbors that don't even know what an opossum is. And freak out when they see an opossum. And I think, oh my gosh, that's so cool. that an opossum can live 16 miles north of Grand Central Station in my backyard. So we need to start rejoicing and celebrating nature instead of being terrified of it.
I'm seeing more and more parks and communities. A lot as we travel, we see communities like go, okay, we got to look at our parks, and that they're starting to understand, because of scientific research and data, and even communities going, we have gang problems, we have anger issues, our community is unhealthy. Like if you have too many homes with too many angry issues, then it's going to become an angry community. And they're starting to put more green spaces in, more trails, park benches, I've done a lot of research on this. I've kind of geeked out over the last few months over this, and it's kind of interesting to see communities step up. Planners stepping up. Some don't, some do, and I encourage everyone to do it because they're starting to see that people change we become better humans when we connect with nature. Have you seen that?
Absolutely. I mean, everyone deserves a connection with nature, and this movement of environmental justice is really profound. I see. So I live near New York City. I see the High Line, which is the raised railway that has been now turned into essentially a huge garden. I don't know if you've had a chance to visit it. But they get literally millions of visitors a year. People have a desperate need to connect with nature and too few opportunities to do that. So, even if you're running a business and you have a little bit of a landscape in front of your business, get a pollinator garden and get kids engaged. You can use some native edible plants too to show folks, that yes, we really are connected here, and really try to make an impression on children when they're young, so they care about nature when they get older.
We recently interviewed a family therapist. It was Dr. Amy Stark. I remember her name. I've got to remember everyone. We do so many interviews, but she came on our show. She had written a children's book about monarchs, and she has a little garden. She's in, I think, is it San Diego or Orange County, Nancy? It's Southern California. And she has a tiny, tiny, tiny garden where her practice is. But because she planted native plants, all the butterflies are there, hummingbirds, you name it. And what happens is that the patients come in, the families with the kids, and everybody's glued to the garden.
Yeah.
And suddenly communication is happening. So her therapist office is starting to happen garden style because of the monarchs. And
That's fantastic.
Isn't that cool?
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I want everyone to understand that connection with nature is so positive. But monarchs, this is a thing too. We're seeing, like, I see stats that, some are that they're doing better, they're not. Where are we in statistics in regards to the monarch butterfly, do you think?
So there are two essential populations of monarchs in North America. One is resident on the West Coast, primarily, California, and then, of course, down into Mexico. But that Western population is crashing and is in really deep, deep trouble. It's a smaller population. The population that overwinters in the mountains of Mexico, that's the population that comes across the country, up here where I am in the northeastern part of the United States. And they're doing better, but it's really all about habitat and absence of pesticides and floral resources. So a lot of people have been planting milkweed. There are many different species of milkweeds in the United States. Pick ones that are appropriate to your particular region. But milkweed's not enough if there are pesticides around. So we got to, again, get off the pesticide kick. But these monarchs that migrate to Mexico, they need that habitat. And, we've just had a couple incidents in Mexico. One person was murdered who was a conservationist.
Oh my God, I know.
So what the heck is going on there? There's something really...
Chemical companies.
Yeah, really, really disturbing. So we need to start protecting these people and protecting those spaces, and make it clear that this can't ever be tolerated and prosecute those crimes.
Well, this is one thing we can take into our own hands. I think when we look at what's going on around the world and in our country, we can all argue and draw lines in the sand, which doesn't really help anything, or we can take action. My favorite quote is from Joan Baez, and action is the antidote to despair. And your book gives us the simple tools of action that we can take care of. You care about butterflies. Well, you better care about butterflies because it's going to result in you having food, right? And they're beautiful to look at, but it's our food. This is our food system. Pollinators are our food system. And nature, Nancy, isn't this true, Nancy? You always talk about this. It's like we don't have a life without nature, right?
No, absolutely not. And the more, like, when I see housing developments go in and then years of them trying to fill the homes, you wonder, well, okay, what did we just do? destroy a bunch of places where nature can thrive, putting out homes, but the homes are so costly that they have trouble selling or renting them out. So it's like we have to start really getting realistic in our thinking.
Absolutely. We're part of nature. It's not an incidental thing for us.
Yeah.
And the sooner that we understand that, the better off we're going to be, because pollinators, animal pollinators. So we're talking about bees and butterflies and bats and moths and even wasps and beetles are the largest group of pollinating animals on Earth. There are many different pollinators, and they actually pollinate about 80% of all flowering plants on Earth. So it's not just our food, but it's all these other flowering plants that exist. Now, it's said that about 1/3 of our food crops are pollinated by animal pollinators, which is a lot. But
That's
the
a lot.
the UN has shown that actually the majority of food crops benefit from animal pollination, even if they don't require it. So the result is increased yields and better quality of food crop. So pollinators are really important, and we can do something about it. That's the great news. Anybody can.
And native plants are pretty. Honestly, I want to touch on this about going and deciding. Okay, we're going to start the garden, right? And start small, like you were saying. Look at the seasons, understand your soil, understand your climate. Now, a lot of times people will go to the big box stores and think these are the right plants to bring home. We've done it, Nancy and I've done it.
Oh, yeah.
We've even done interviews with the other side and going, oopsie. So we've learned in a really hard way. So I want to talk about the importance of supporting native plant nurseries.
Absolutely.
Like bookstores, okay? It's like the
thank
same
you.
thing.
If we don't support the people that are dedicating their lives to growing native plants and supporting our ecosystems, if we don't support them, they vanish. It's really hard work and the margins are really thin. So, when you go to a farmer's market and you decide, I really want to eat organic and I really want to support, heirloom varieties, you're willing to pay more. Right? So be willing to go to native nurseries that are doing it right, that are growing pesticide free, that are growing the native plants that belong in the region, that are often growing from seed, which is the hardest possible thing to do with woody plants, trees and shrubs and vines. Really tough work. But they're promoting genetic diversity that way. Be prepared to pay more for those plants because they cost more to grow, and support that effort, or else we lose those resources. So the big box stores don't have the greatest practices in terms of how they deal with their suppliers. And you really don't know what you're getting when you go to a big box store, how it's been grown, where it's been grown. Did it come from across the country or is it local? Is the pot that you're picking up filled with a pest or disease that is now being introduced into the region where you are? So buying local from local nurseries is best practice in my view.
And also when you plant native plants, I mean, because I remember this whole thing of native plants there was the ornamental craze that I think ruined a lot of things on top of big ag, right? So the ornamental stuff, yes, it's pretty, but we could be planting the natives. And honestly, when you have when you're I'm sorry, but when you sleep in a park and you're surrounded by Mother Nature as intended, that's integrity and left to be who she is, you have all the native plants around you and all the native birds come out and all the beautiful creatures that this is their home. There is something magical about it, and you feel more like you belong when you do that. Right.
And different people have a different aesthetic, right? So I like a very naturalistic aesthetic. Some people like a more formal aesthetic, and you can plant natives in both fashions. It doesn't have to be one or the other. And there's so many gorgeous native plants. But I suggest to listeners that you find the beauty not only in how a plant looks, but what a plant does. and then you'll never forget that. So, a beautiful goldenrod is never more beautiful than when it's got a bee or a butterfly or some other pollinator pollinating on it. So we need to find that beauty. And again, we can do it in a more formal fashion or landscapes, or a looser fashion, depending on your aesthetic. And, sometimes homeowners associations can be a little bit problematic too.
Now, what about, then that's, you can be the person that educates them. Everybody in their homeowners association, get on the board and educate. So we have political systems for that reason. When you look at spring, and especially in your area, I know that there's like, you get like all of a sudden the snow is melting off and everything. Is there anything we should know about that? Because I know, it's springtime. Things start to come out, and then you start wondering about all these wiggly things, and should we trim the pond back, that kind of thing.
Well, early spring in many parts of the country is a crucial time, because a lot of pollinators are starting to wake up, and not every pollinator says, oh, it's March 1st, I'm up and about. They come out gradually, and they have different lifespans. But in the spring, there are, for example, native bumblebees that are some of our earliest ones to emerge. And the mated queens, if they've survived the winter, if you've provided enough fall blooming native plants for them to go into winter well fed, and you've given them habitat, well, those overwintering queens, they're going to be hungry. They're going to be looking for forage resources, nectar and pollen. And, they may have already mated in fall, and they're looking for a place to raise their brood. So thinking about some of these early flowering plants in my neck of the woods, it's going to include things like red maples and pussy willows. Depends on the part of the country that you're in, but having a lot of those early bloomers, really important. And we don't often think of trees and shrubs as being pollinator plants, but at least in the Northeast, they're some of our earliest emerging pollinator plants. And then we have spring ephemerals, which you guys have probably seen. I'm sure you've been to the Smoky Mountains, which is just...
Not yet. We're getting there.
Not yet?
You got
to go to the Smokies.
It's on our list this year. It's coming.
Perfect. So that's just a magical place to go to see spring ephemerals, native plants that emerge in woodland settings before the trees leaf out, and are some of the earliest resources for pollinators, early pollinators in the spring. Things like trout lilies and Dutchman's breeches and all these wonderful plants. So get to know the plants of your area, your region. And one great way to do that is to join your local native plant organization. That's just an inexpensive way to learn a lot. A lot of these organizations throughout the country have websites just loaded with information about native plants, where to buy them, tips, etc. And then there's some wonderful resources like the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center's database on native plants. You can do a search by your state and take a look and see what's native. You can do a filtered search if you're looking for, say, spring bloomers versus fall, or trees versus perennials, etc. And there are other really good resources for plant lists. I've provided some regional lists on my website. Couldn't get everything in the book, so there's a lot more information on my website. But it's a pleasure learning this stuff.
It's fun.
Yeah, it's really fun.
I think one of the biggest problems is when you go into a nursery, whether it be a small one or a box store one, the native plant section seems to be way far away in the little corner at the back, with plants that look like they're barely surviving. and no, you know what I'm talking about, right?
I've seen those nurseries.
Yeah, and then when they do bloom, the flowers are so tiny.
Yeah, it depends on where you are.
That they're just not as impressive as let's go look at the camellias and even if they don't belong where you are.
That's why I like your book so much, is that you prove that native plants
I think that
beautiful.
But that's the one thing that I've noticed, is that it's not native plants first. They're in the back corner, and they don't look that healthy, and they look really tiny. in the blooming, that like you want the big flower or the tiny flower. There's that, and then there's also the convenience of the lawn, which I think it's funny because everybody goes, oh, let's get rid of all this, put in a lawn, and then they don't want to mow the lawn. Well, and they get really upset about having to mow the lawn all the time. Oh, well, if you didn't have a lawn, you wouldn't have to mow it.
It's amazing.
And then, and the other thing is what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Let me just spray everything and kill everything all at one time without thinking. I mean, the idea of spraying poison, which is exactly what we are doing. We're spraying, it's poisonous for us and for all kinds of creatures. And we just go, oh. And what gets me is you can actually buy poison and spray it.
Oh yeah, it's actually easier for a homeowner to buy pesticides than it is for a licensed pesticide applicator. But let me make a comment about native nurseries. So I suggest you do a couple things. One is find your local native nurseries that focus on natives. So that's number one, because they know what they're doing. Number two, go to the nurseries that maybe don't do such a great job and encourage them to get more natives and grow them better. And you can be a bit clever with this. If you belong to an environmental organization, for example, like I belong to the Native Plant Center here in New York. Well, we've partnered with a local nursery. I think we're into our 10th year now, where every fall we do a big native plant festival, and we bring in all the volunteers, and they bring in native plants that they never bought before. Cool. And we increase their sales. We double their sales that weekend, and they love us. So being creative, there are a lot of local organizations that do native plant sales in the spring and the fall in various parts of the country. Support those. Audubon societies are starting to do a lot of this. But you got to get the word out. And if a nursery doesn't have natives, ask them why not.
Yeah, exactly. And botanical gardens too. A lot of them, like San Diego Botanical Garden, been there. They have their ornamentals and things because a lot grows in that environment. But they also have this huge section dedicated to xeriscape landscaping, xeriscape, conserving water and California native plants. That's their big thing. And so that's important. I mean, it's like I sometimes look at botanical gardens as zoos in a weird way. You know what I mean? It's like, I think they're very, very important to understanding. And it's cool when you can see plants from another country. But I really think that there's that side that I've seen botanical gardens slowly, like we were just in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and their main purpose is to teach locals that, number one, you can have plants in the desert and you can do it in the right way and with natives. And it was amazing what we saw. I mean, it was absolutely beautiful. The native plants are beautiful. And isn't it like once we plant them, and I want to go back to Nancy talking about, the ugly native plant in the corner, because some native plants, if they're in their dormancy stage, like an ocotillo in the desert here in the Southwest, where we are right now, an ocotillo, when it's not in its green and blooming stage, looks like a stick, and you're going to think it's dead, but it's not. And so when you go to buy one, you'll go, oh, it's dead. This is a bad nursery. So that's another factor, is native plants have different cycles, and you talk about that extensively in your book about cycles. So that's something to understand too, that it's not always blooming and pretty when you go to the nursery, because it's just the wrong season for that.
Yeah, we've had such a focus on annuals. Things have to look great for month after month after month. And a lot of those plants are so overbred that they really provide almost nothing for nature. So I'm very suspicious of plants that have been bred to like be constant bloomers. And our eye obviously is often attracted to the big showy things, but let's look a little deeper. Like hydrangeas are very big in this part of the country, not so much where you guys are from. Although lots of people who live in desert areas are trying to grow hydrangeas, which is nothing short of insane. But the big pom-pom hydrangeas that have the big showy flowers have very, very few fertile flowers. Those showy flowers are infertile. So I like to suggest to clients, listen, if you like that, we'll get you one of those. But let's get some of our native hydrangeas in that are less showy, but have many more fertile flowers with nectar and pollen for insects. So it's perspective, it's context, it's understanding the function that this plant is supposed to actually provide, not just how it looks to your eyeball that moment.
It's cool. You talk about hydrangeas. I have to say, one of the coolest experiences we had on the tour in 2019 was Florissant Fossil Beds National Monument in Colorado. So everybody flocks in Colorado Springs area to the Garden of the Gods. And they literally do, to the point that you want to run. There's so many people. But you go west a little bit. That's why we go in circles. This Florissant Fossil Beds is this crazy park of they have petrified redwoods in Colorado. And it's amazing. You can't even believe it until you're there. But then you go and see the fossil collection in the visitor center, and they have fossilized hydrangeas.
Oh, that's so cool.
How crazy is that? Because I
cool.
never thought of hydrangeas even being native.
Yeah, we do have some native.
I was like, holy cow, hydrangeas were there millions of years ago?
Sure. Before.
Seriously.
Yeah.
Think about that. I mean, millions. Was it 2 million years ago they were here?
Well,
dude.
You know, there are so mane plants to choose from, no matter where you live, that are native and that are beautiful, that really, thinking that quote unquote ornamental, I don't even know what that really means. What does that mean? To me, all plants have an ornamental aspect, but we've gotten ourselves into trouble by focusing on non-natives, and you can see that, and you do, I'm sure, across the country, with the proliferation of invasive plants that come from other continents, mostly Asia, unfortunately, some from Europe, that have overtaken our native habitats and are, where I live, you go up a parkway and you just see invasive vines smothering the entire woodland. I mean, they're killing everything. So we have to pay a little bit more attention to what we plant and to anticipate what it might do if it's too aggressive. A lot of the plants that we brought into the country in the late 1800s and early 1900s for ornamental gardens are now some of our biggest garden thugs. And they do, an invasive plant is defined to either do harm to the environment or to human health or to agriculture. And we see this constantly. So take a look at your state's invasive species list and make sure, one, you don't buy any of these plants if they're still found for sale, and unfortunately sometimes they are. And look at the states near you and don't use the plants that are invasive on those lists either. And if you have some of these invasive plants, start removing them and replacing them with native alternatives that support our ecosystems. That's super important. And the lawn, I can't overstate how important it is to start replacing some lawn with more wildlife supportive native plantings. It's so critical. As development just keeps going, our own home landscapes have never been more important at any time. And, I see with clients, we plant and boom, the birds, the butterflies, the bees, the mammals appear. And we really can make a difference.
We really can. And lastly, on the native plant part, where when you purchase them, they will take time to get familiar with your surroundings. It's going to take a couple years, right? Depending on the plant.
Not necessarily. It depends on the plant species. So with perennial plants, I often use plant plugs, very small, deep-rooted plants. Kind of looks like if you're going to the garden center to get a tray of annuals, kind of looks like that with deeper roots. And it's a very inexpensive way to buy plants. And I have been stunned at planting plugs in, say, May, and then by fall, they're full size in some cases. So it really depends on the species that you are planting. But it's extraordinary, and it's all about planting the right plant in the right place too, right? So if you know your soil conditions, you understand your region, and you plant the right plant in the right place, you don't put sun lovers in shade, you don't put plants that like fast drainage and droughty soil and a wet condition. By following those basic principles of gardening, put the right plant in the right place, you're going to have much better success. And don't be afraid with trees and shrubs to buy small.
Yeah.
Well-grown, containerized plants typically grow much, much faster than a large specimen that's been balled and burlapped, where 80% or more of the root system has been dug up. So don't be afraid of small, and have a little patience. I know we're not very patient society, but
right, that's a problem. Yeah, well, gardening will create patience.
Yes.
And it's so cool to go out. That's so Nancy and I, right, Nancy, the one thing we miss, it's like when we get to a place like right now, we're in Yuma for a little bit, and we'll go walk the wetlands and see the gardens of the hotel that we're at, the Coronado Motor Hotel. People stay here just because there's a garden. You can just sit with the birds, and it's amazing how many species do you think are in the palm trees, Nancy?
Oh gosh, there's so many. There are birds that go up into the palm trees that you wouldn't think even fit.
I know, and they're all living next to each other in their own little colonies, and it's like we sit there, we have our wine time with the birds under the palms, and we're like, well, you have to have wine time, and and we're like, oh my gosh, check this out, and here it is, and it's all native plants, and it's like, okay, this is cool. So our time is like we go walk the wetlands here, which is a big restoration project. Took 49 agencies coming together to restore the wetlands of the lower Colorado River.
Wow.
And they're really doing it, taking the invasives out. We've been watching this go for 20 years. We've been watching this process. Seriously, from one hummingbird bush, which was like a little, what do you call it? The Cape hummingbird, the little red, the little tubular one. It's orange tubular hummingbird style plant. Anyway,
hummingbirds love red tubular flowers. Yep.
Yeah, there's one native plant. They have a wetlands, a garden here. It's all for hummingbirds and butterflies. It's all native plants. And we went and did a whole walk around with the guys who maintain it. And they say that people come to the garden and they go, well, where's the flowers? And they're standing right next to it, like the fairy duster flowers and things like that. People don't realize that that's part of the whole thing. But it's really magical because we go every day and something new happens. And it's the same as having your own garden. You're in the backyard. When you plant something, you will see something happen every day. Everything changes.
And plant diversity translates into wildlife diversity.
Yes.
So the more, diverse array of native plants that you have, the more creatures that are coming. And, I encourage folks to start making a list of what they're seeing. And if you can get a picture of it, use iNaturalist or another app like that to identify it and get your kids engaged. Kids want to be on these, on the phones constantly. Well, get them iNaturalist so they can start identifying what they're seeing. It's a wonderful resource.
Citizen science.
Yeah, exactly. So, really that whole thing about diversity, that is our greatest tool in the face of climate change. And we depend on the ecosystem services that a healthy environment provides. And if we don't improve environmental health, we miss that opportunity at our own risk.
And be nice to the worms and the snakes. They're part of it. Spiders too.
Yeah,
They're all part of it. They're all part of it. Thank you so much, Kim.
Well, thank you.
Beautiful, beautiful book. Nancy's holding on to it. We're like,
I love it.
I know. I think it's going to be part of our education as we travel.
Well, thank you so much for that.
No, really, it's beautiful, but it really gives you tips on getting started, and you can start small. It's not like an overnight, like, oh my God, I have to redo my entire garden. You can get started, start small, and get your kids involved. Schools, we've seen things of people making these changes across the country, and it is so cool to see kids light up with things. When they see a bug or a caterpillar eating, they're like, "Ooh, look at that! That's so cool!" and you know things are happening, and it can happen right in your backyard. So check it out, everyone. Go to ecobeneficial.com. Again, the book is by Kim Eierman. It's Eierman. And I'm just trying to prove I can spell Kim.
And so, you're exactly correct.
Okay, good. And everybody, the book name is The Pollinator Victory Garden: Win the War on Pollinator Decline with Ecological Gardening. Again, ecobeneficial.com. Go to Amazon, all those places, and go to your local bookstore and say, I want the book. And go to your botanical garden, because they have gift shops too, and say, I want the book. Just saying. All of those places, even nurseries, right? Okay, they have books. So just say, I want the book. So go there. And we also want to give a shout out and thank you to our sponsor for today's show, which is fine art nature photographer Margot Carrera. She has, go check out her work. She loves nature and everything that we're talking about today. It is carrerafineartgallery.com. Beautiful, beautiful work and gifts. I mean, scarves with sunflowers and all kinds of good things. She talks about wrapping yourself in nature. She understands the healing powers of nature, and that's what she's all about. And she has assigned us to a project to document gardens across America as we travel, not just parks. And we've even learned that cemeteries are gardens. It's amazing. Rest stop areas, some places, I want to give a shout out to Missouri and Kansas for having pollinator gardens in their rest areas. So I think it's important that we use every space in the right way and give nature its land back. I'm just going to say it that way. So thank you, Margot, for sending us on the assignment. It's fun. We have so many more places to put on the map. It's pretty crazy. It's almost like covering all the parks that we've been to. So check it out on nationalparktraveling.com if you want to follow our map, or just go to loveyourparkstour.com. Of course, keep up with us at bigblendradio.com. And Kim, we love to play music for our guests and for our listeners that go with the topic. And today's song is Pink Fairy Duster and Hummingbird Moths.
Fabulous. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Here it is, everyone. It's from Michael and Spider, and it's off of their album, Perfume of Creosote. Thanks so much, Kim.
Thank you.